This is a Renegade Media Network podcast.
I got to tell you guys about Zippix nicotine toothpicks. They're flavored toothpicks with nicotine in each one. I want to tell you about them because you might have heard them advertised now on some other podcasts because their name is getting out there. Let me tell you this little fact. This was the first podcast that they ever advertised on, and that is because I actually reached out to them. I already used this product, and I thought I might as well advertise for them. That's how much I like them, and I still use them all the time. They're flavored toothpicks, like I said, with nicotine in each one. Check out the flavors. Peppermint, watermelon, excellent. They've got the old school cinnamon. Remember the cinnamon toothpicks you would have as a kid? This is basically the adult version. They've got sweet whiskey, sweet wood. They've got mocha, spice, island clove. Very, very good as well. So basically, if you're trying to kick a bad habit, maybe go for the cheapest alternative on the market. That would be Zippix toothpicks over at zippixtoothpicks.com. And of course, they want to support this show, and so do you. And if you want to buy some of these toothpicks, that helps this show out. So promo code BUCK at checkout, BUCK, gets you 20% off of your order. That is 20% off when you enter promo code BUCK, BUCK, at zippixtoothpicks.com. Let's get to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another edition, another episode of the Counterflow Podcast. What a great time I had out at the Childerberg event in Central Texas. I was at the Iron Wolf Distillery, which was a great venue, and the comedy was good, the music was good, the friends were good, we were all having a great time, and I did end up going to the campsite. I had not initially planned to do that because I had a hotel room nearby, but man, I'm glad we went out there. What a cool little, that's really where the party was at, is the campsite. Got to hang out with the Austin ANCAP group friends, got to meet some of you guys that listen to this show, got to hang with my man Kyle Ruff and Rodney the Fire Bernstein. See what I did there, Robbie? Yes, great time had by all. My point is, if you're thinking about going next year, you should do it. It's a really fun time, and I definitely will do it again. As for this show today, I've got on from the Mises Institute, Peter St Onge. See, it's two economists in a row named Peter from the Mises Institute. I'm on a roll. I wanted to talk about inflation, the economy as it sits right now. What are we witnessing? What are we going through? Gas prices are up, food prices are up, lumber prices are up. Is that all just due to inflation? Is it that pipeline shutdown that happened? Are gas prices up because it's summer and they always go up? What is going on? And so Peter is here to talk about all of that. And lo and behold, I'm researching him, and he's an expert on Bitcoin and crypto, which I think ties in quite well to the current economic discussions. Because if you're not sure on what Bitcoin is, I know it's all the rage lately. I want you guys to find out about it, basically. It's what is it? What makes it special? Is it a store of value? Is it a legitimate currency? Why won't it inflate like the dollar does? What is it backed by? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we get into all of that. And let me tell you really quick about Peter. He's a Mises Institute Associated Scholar and Fellow at the Montreal Economic Institute. Peter St Onge received his PhD from George Mason University and was a 2014 Mises Institute Research Fellow. He's with us for the first time here on Counterflow. Peter St Onge, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, I was looking to have someone with a brilliant economic mind on the show that could talk about inflation and some things that we may or may not be seeing right now. And I reached out to my friend Tho Bishop, and I said, who would be really good at this? And he immediately said, you. So I'm glad to have you here, and I'm glad Tho recommended you, and that's obviously a recommendation that I take with some some high value. So it's your first time on here. I got to get a little bit of a introduction on who you are, what you do for the audience listening.
Right. So I am a former professor, PhD economist from George Mason, which is sort of the mothership of Austrian economics. I went there for Austrian economics. And nowadays I am working at Heritage Foundation. I'm broadly speaking very libertarian. I like bottom-up community origin solutions to problems. I write a lot nowadays on cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin, which solves, I think, a lot of the problems that we're facing to do with money, central banking, but also decentralization, right? So there is an increasing trend towards getting permission from bureaucrats to engage in commerce, nowadays to engage in speech. And so the need for some kind of non-government solution, in fact, non-corporate solution, right? Because a lot of these restrictions are actually coming from corporations. So the need for a decentralized, commerce platform, speech platform is, I think we can agree, has intensified.
So it's interesting. You said you went to George Mason University kind of because of Austrian economics and the program they have there. What got you into Austrian economics to begin with? Because we're lucky to have the people in this space, but it's not a very common thing for sure.
It's funny. The world has changed a lot because of the internet, of course, right? And, when I was growing up, the internet just came out when I was in my early 20s. And you didn't have the kind of access to heterodox ideas back then. You really had to kind of get lucky. You had to stumble in some anarchist bookstore or something like that. Almost all of the books were going to be, pretty extreme left wing, but every so often you'd get lucky and you'd find, something from Rothbard or something like that. Now, I did not get lucky, so I had actually never heard of Murray Rothbard. I'd never heard of Austrian economics all through my BA program.
Wow.
And I actually majored in economics at McGill University, which is, it's a prestigious school. And literally I was unaware that there was a different way to look at economics. I just reading on my own for fun, and probably actually came across it because of the internet, because at that point there wasn't internet. Now we're talking mid-90s. I just stumbled across, first Mises, the Mises Institute, and then Rothbard. And, for me, Rothbard was really an eye-opener. In terms of theory, he has a lot in common with Mises and Menger, but just the presentation, Rothbard style, he takes these theories and applies them to real-world controversies. He's got a real nice style of writing. So that really crystallized a lot of things for me. And then at that time, I was in corporate marketing and sort of missed the intellectual challenge. So came back for the PhD. When it was time for that, I'd sort of become disillusioned with mainstream economics, which I think is basically a statistical game. And so, went to a place that focused on Austrian economics.
All right, well, let's kind of put that lens on and look through it and kind of break down what we're looking at now, because I see things like gas prices going up, lumber prices going up, and then I kind of think it must be partially due to inflation, because we know how much money has been printed over the COVID crisis and whatnot. But then I see, there was this pipeline issue with fuel. And then I see there was breaks in the supply chain. Maybe that's what's affecting the lumber prices and whatnot. So I'm kind of trying to figure out, is this inflation that we're looking at? Is it due to something else? What kind of economy are we looking at right now in your mind?
Right. And that's always the trick. in economics is that you have noise and then you have trend, right? So, if you're getting older, you might hurt yourself more. You might injure your ankle. You might get hurt here and there. And one by one, you interpret those as, oh, I had bad luck. I went down the stairs funny. Okay. But when you see enough of them, you start to conclude, maybe this is more of a trend than noise. Okay. Maybe it's not just that my luck has worsened. Maybe there's something, going on sort of under the hood. And so in this case, we know from strong theory and ancient theory over centuries, we know that an increase in the amount of money in circulation is going to lead to higher prices. And, this is very intuitive. And what we're seeing now is, a lot of people have been warning about higher inflation for, really ever since the 70s. There's been this sort of industry, frankly, of Chicken Littles. People, I think they've lost credibility in many ways by, calling for hyperinflation and predicting hyperinflation essentially constantly. But finally, for the first time in a little bit over a decade anyway, we're starting to see some actual real inflation in there, some significant inflation. Now, if you dig into it, then you can sort of explain each one with noise, with very specific factors. And what those generally relate to is the COVID pandemic, right? So there were a bunch of industries where they were temporarily super cheap because nobody was going to hotels or restaurants or taking planes. So those were temporarily cheap. Now that things are getting back to normal, you get a jump in price, but that's really just a jump back to normalcy, right? So that accounts for some of the inflation. And then another chunk of the inflation is coming from supply chain disruptions. So there are various industries where generally because of COVID, there is an imbalance in the supply and demand. So either they might have had to close factories, or they might have had some like COVID safety requirements or whatever. So there are some industries where they're producing less because of COVID restrictions. And then there are other industries where they just had a huge jump in demand. So for example, during the pandemic, a lot of people wanted to redo their decks, or they wanted to renovate their house. And so you had these temporary jumps in people wanting to buy doors, so if you put those two together, where you have an industry that was forced to close down production or to contract early in the pandemic, and then meanwhile they get this jump in demand, then you can get kind of these funny dislocations where that sort of a situation is resolved by, in a free market, it's resolved by rising prices. So at this point, the question is understanding which of those sort of noise factors are permanent, and which of them are, we can put stories on stuff, but fundamentally, is there some underlying trend where, sure, we stumbled on the stairs, but it's because we're getting older. So in other words, all of these idiosyncratic factors that are obviously pandemic related, well, okay, but is are they reflecting a wider trend of more money running around the economy? So at this point, it's probably too early to say in general. We're probably at the point where people should be paying a lot more attention to inflation than they have over the past decade, because it is throwing off some warning signs. We can tell satisfying stories about a lot of that inflation, right? The people going to hotels again and things like that. But we want to be aware that, sometimes the forest or the trees can hide the forest, right? Yes. So we want to be aware that sometimes these short-term just so stories, right? In retrospect, you can look back and say, well, that was just people misinterpreting the first signs of inflation. Indeed, if we take something like the 1970s, I mean, early on when prices started going up, there were all kinds of stories that people told, about, wages are going up because, you had a new restriction, or, it's summertime. And, this is human nature, right? When we see some kind of new movement that's unexpected, we try to come up with some story that's familiar. So, we're still at that story stage, and it's too early to say whether those stories are capturing all of the effect, or whether we are starting to see some of all that new money come into prices.
I want to just quickly touch upon the Federal Reserve, because I find myself, no pun intended, in this bubble sometimes where, of course, we understand what it does. And then I'll get questions or emails from listeners, and they'll say, you just kind of glossed over that. Can you explain it deeper? And so the Fed is a topic that I think I kind of take for granted that everyone knows what it does, right? Can you touch upon, I want to hit it in two ways, the formal purpose of the Federal Reserve, what I mean by that is what they say they're supposed to be doing, and then the informal purpose in really what they actually do. Can you kind of give an elevator pitch for that, please?
Yeah. So the sort of selling point on the Fed, on central banks in general, is that what they allegedly do is stabilize the economy. So they're like the captain of a ship who steers it between these dangerous extremes of inflation and a slow economy. Okay, so in theory, they're supposed to put us right through the middle, and they're supposed to very delicately trade off economic growth, which is generally registered as employment. So trade off employment against rising prices. So that's the selling point, and that's how they sell themselves. That's how, sort of mainstream fans will view them, that their job is to stabilize, keep prices stable, keep growth nice and steady, because in their mind, if growth gets too hot, like if growth goes too fast, then you're likely to see prices going up. And so that's, in theory, what they do is stabilize. In reality, what they do is cause the problem in the first place. So metaphorically, the Fed puts a $1 trillion glass vase, they put that on the table, and they bump it, and then they catch it. And they bump it again, and then they catch it again. This is their game. And we pay them a lot of money to do this. Only it's not a $1 trillion vase, it's the entire economy. They are the source of the instability. Now, that, I think they don't intend to be that. What they originally intended to be, and again, we're talking reality, we're not talking the marketing that was used to sell it. What they were originally intended to be was essentially a way to inject as much inflation as the people will accept. Okay. And why inject inflation? Because the people who installed the Federal Reserve, which are large banks, and this is not conspiracy, this is historical fact. They were installed by people who came from the banking sector. They were installed at the behest of banks. At the time, it was the Rockefeller and the Morgans who ran the country. This is historical fact. This is not some strange conspiracy. The banks love inflation. Inflation. What you're doing with inflation is you're pouring water into the wine of everybody who owns dollars, right? So if you're the one pouring the water in, that's incredibly profitable. The original intent was to produce inflation. Central banks make inflation. What the, I think, unintentional result has been is that they also create crises. And the reason that they create crises is because by creating inflation, you create, Tom Woods called it a tissue fire. All right. So you get a fire that burns too bright, too fast, and then burns out real fast. And what that's in the form of is that by making money too easy, by making it too easy to borrow money through lower interest rates, you get sort of an economy that's just awash with all of this money. And there's a quote, Stephen Livera mentioned it on his podcast, but essentially, idiots become entrepreneurs. Okay, people who no banker should have taken that call, right? In a hard money system, that person should have been left out of the room. The idea is stupid, or the people are unqualified, or for whatever reason, they were a bad investment. But because the system is so flush with easy money, they say, why not? And so you get this rush of essentially bad investments, which in Austrian economics are called malinvestments. And as you get that rush, you start to get inflation. That makes the bankers nervous. And so at that point, the bankers do jack up interest rates. And in fact, they typically overreact. So now money is too tight, right? So you're doing this, you're slamming on the gas and then you're slamming on the brakes and doing it again and again and again. Hence the metaphor of tipping the vase, and then they hopefully catch it and they do it again and again. And so that gives us the familiar business cycle, right? This modern cycle of 8 or 10 years where, you can very clearly see it in Federal Reserve rates. They push rates too low, start to get inflation, push rates too high, and then start it all over again.
I want to hit upon something that I don't think a lot of people think of in these terms. What is the U.S. dollar backed by?
Right. So for a long time, it was backed by gold in various forms. Ever since the 1970s, that's not been the case. So essentially, what it's backed by is a belief that the Fed will not create too much of it. All right. And this didn't have a name until an analog in crypto came out with stable coins, which is called an algorithmic central bank, is what they call it in stable coins, but it's a great term for it. So that's essentially what it's backed by. It's an algorithmic asset where in order for the dollar to hold value, the Fed has to be relatively conservative in allowing new ones to be created. If the Fed becomes reckless, then new dollars will be created much faster. So, on a sort of fundamental level, it's backed by the fact that people accept it. And why do people accept it? Because they believe that the Fed will be relatively conservative in allowing new ones to be created. Now, in the past year, that confidence has been shaken as the Fed has allowed a lot more money to be created. Now, so far, that money has generally been saved in bank accounts. So during the pandemic, people massively jacked up savings, and partly they did that because they were worried about the future. Partly they also did it because of how they got the new money, right? So, if it comes in as stimulus checks, people tend to save. Almost all of a stimulus check gets saved. It does not, in fact, go to poor people who are struggling to afford dinner. It actually almost all gets saved. And this is general. This is in all cases. Going back on stimulus checks for 40 years now, they're always saved. So that's, healthy in the near term for inflation, because if it's saved, then, they may as well have buried it in the backyard for the time being.
Right.
And banks, meanwhile, are not lending out all of the new money. And so the new money probably hasn't hit prices yet. We're going to see what starts happening when people reduce their savings again. And at that point, we might expect to see more of that sort of trend in inflation.
I want to tell you guys about the official coffee of the Counterflow podcast, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee over at lorenzotti.coffee. I don't really want to specifically tell you about them because I drink it every morning, because I love it, because it's directly imported from Italy. It's in these vacuum sealed packs. It's in these beautiful tins that look very good on your kitchen counter. Those aren't really the reasons I want to tell you about them. The real reason is because in this day and age, with all of the insanity going on, I think it's nice to be able to have companies that are very like-minded that we can support. And that's very helpful. You know, everyone's scared now, like, should I support this company? I don't know, are they crazy? Well, I can tell you, the guys at Lorenzati.coffee are really good guys. They're like-minded individuals, and they want to support shows like mine that you listen to. So I think if they're willing to give me a cut of the money coming into them from you guys, that should make you want to support them. You like this show, you want to support like-minded companies, well, here's one for you, Lorenzati Coffee over at LORENZOTTI.coffee. I'll tell you one thing, if you type in promo code BUCK, B-U-C-K, at checkout, you will get 10% off of your order. You'll be supporting a very good company. The coffee is amazing, and it helps me out too. So if you like this show, give it some support. Now back to the show. You mentioned crypto there, and in doing my research on you for this interview, I realized how much you know about it and Bitcoin specifically. And it was good timing because I would say over the past 6 months, maybe, I've become more interested in Bitcoin specifically. I read the Bitcoin Standard book, which I've found amazing. And because it takes Bitcoin and crypto and puts an Austrian economic kind of focus on it, which helped me because that's the understanding that I have of economics to begin with. So for my listeners out there, if you have not read that book, I do highly recommend it. I want to get into Bitcoin, that topic with you. And you wrote on this segment that I watched and just shook my head the whole time. I still watch Bill Maher. I've watched him for years. He's one of the few voices on the left that I can actually take and not just turn the TV off and yell at him. And we have some agreements, actually, every once in a while. He's actually been interesting on the lockdowns and COVID. But he had a ridiculous segment on Bitcoin, calling it pretend, kind of basically a lot of the insults you hear on it, pretend money, and it's for these weirdos, libertarians and whatnot. But it's also interesting when you compare what the actual the dollar's really backed by, and he's pretending that that's legitimate and that Bitcoin is imaginary. So let's get into that. And I want to give it kind of a simplistic understanding, maybe or explanation for my listeners that are like, I just don't know what it is. It's fake money. It seems weird. I don't want to invest. It's a honeypot. All of these things you hear about it. What's your elevator pitch then on Bitcoin versus the dollar, and why Bitcoin is legitimate and how it's different from the dollar, we'll say?
Right. So the reason why a lot of people are so excited about Bitcoin is that you can basically run an entire money system without any intermediary, okay, with no bank, no credit card, nobody in between. It's peer-to-peer, person to person. Years ago we had BitTorrent, right? Remember there was a file sharing system called BitTorrent where you could pirate movies and stuff.
Yeah.
And the sort of architecture of Bitcoin is very similar, where it's just person to person. There's nothing in between. And the reason why this works is that it's a decentralized ledger, which means that basically it's a list. It's a list of who owns what. And the who owns what it doesn't have your name on it. It has your account number on it. But there's this list of who owns what. And then, people can use their home computers to verify the list. The structure is similar to SETI at Home, right? That was a project back in the 90s where people were using their home computers to go look for distant galaxies. It's a little bit like that. It's something that can run in the background. I'm talking the early stages. At this point, Bitcoin's much bigger and it works a little differently. But just sort of to understand the concept behind it, it's a list of who owns what, and that list is maintained by everybody. And shockingly, this is extraordinarily secure. It is far more secure than the US dollar system. more secure than our banking system. It has never been hacked. When you hear about Bitcoin hacks, these are Bitcoin exchanges. These are websites where they have databases where you can buy and sell Bitcoin. That's not Bitcoin. That's an online database like Amazon.com. Right? Amazon.com is fundamentally a giant database. All right, those things can be hacked. Yeah, of course. Websites are hacked all the time. What cannot, or at any rate has never been hacked, is Bitcoin. That fundamental list of who owns what, that cannot be hacked, at least to date. Many, many very good hackers have tried. I mean, the top hackers in the world have tried. Why? Because there's so much money.
Yeah.
Right? If you manage to hack Bitcoin, you will be a billionaire many times over. All right. It is an enormous honeypot to hack it. And by the way, the governments won't come after you. All right. If you hack the US banking system, you're going to get a visit. Mm-hmm. All right. If you hack back Bitcoin, the Fed will cheer you. Okay. Yeah. You're not going to get a visit. Go for it, kiddo. So there was a famous researcher. I can't remember his name. He just passed away recently. But he was like a god in the sort of hacking community. Mm-hmm. And he's a professor here and there. I mean, the guy was top flight, and he was poo-pooing Bitcoin early on because he said, this thing's goofy. Here, I'm going to go break it. And he spent months and months, and he got his whole network in, and they worked it, and they could not break it. And he came back and said, you know what? I love this thing. This thing is incredible. All right, it is battle hardened. Anton Antonopoulos, he does a lot of good videos. He kind of explains Bitcoin for beginners. You can find his stuff on YouTube. Anyway, Anton's got this really nice quote. He calls Bitcoin the mutant sewer rat. All right, this thing it's been shot, it's been stabbed, it's been run over, it's been set on fire. I mean, you name it, and it's been thrown at Bitcoin. You look at U.S. banks and the delicate world that they live in. Where somebody steals your finger sandwich, and it's a big deal. You got to call the cops. No, Bitcoin came up through the sewers. This thing is, we can never say the future, but I mean, it's as close to unkillable as you can get. And when I say unkillable, unbreakable, unhackable. This thing is robust. And including what specifically is appealing to libertarians, it's robust to governments.
Yes.
And that's a really key point here, is that private currencies are constantly created. There's very good economic theory why private currencies are better than government currencies. And in a nutshell, because the market disciplines you. Okay, if you wake up one morning and start printing out counterfeit notes in your basement, nobody's going to take them. All right, you've got to show people why they trust you. And this is why banks used to be made of granite.
Yeah.
Right. So before the Fed took over money, banks were these beautiful palaces. They look like temples. They look like the Acropolis. Now you go down to the mall and you look at the Wells Fargo, and it's not the Acropolis. And the reason is because nobody cares about trust anymore. And right, so that trust is really what underpins private currencies. So private currencies are wonderful. The problem is that the government would kill with prejudice every private currency that bumped along. There's a guy named Bernard von Nothaus, and this is back right around when Bitcoin was coming out. Nothaus was not into Bitcoin at the time, but and he's kind of a gadfly. He's been around for a long time. He's kind of a character in the Liberty community. But anyway, he had a project where he was printing up, I think they're called Liberty dollars. Mm-hmm. And a Liberty dollar looked like a real dollar coin, but it was made of pure silver. And it said, I think it said "In God We Trust," and it had various insignia. And his point was that the U.S. dollar is a fake, and so he was going to print real money. So they went after him for counterfeiting. Right now, these things had like $50 worth of silver in them, and he was calling them $1. Right, that would be the worst counterfeiter in history.
Yeah. Yes.
right? I mean, clearly the guy was not doing this to lose $49 on every theft, right? But that was the attitude. All right, they went after, there was another group, eGold, I think they were operating out of California. And the idea was that you would have a gold account, you would have physical gold in your account, and you could go out and spend that like on a credit card or something. Great idea again, right? You're replacing US dollar with a private currency, in this case, gold. Fantastic. They go to California. They say, hey, I think we might need a money transmitting license. California said, no, you can't have a license. You're not a money transmitter. Get out of here. Stop wasting my time. Good. A couple months later, the feds show up. The feds say, where's your money transmitter license? I said, well, California told us we didn't need one. In fact, they wouldn't give us one. The feds said, well, that's California. That's not me. Who are those guys to me? No, this is between you and me, pal. That's the world, all right? That's what they do. They ban every form of competition so that you have to use the garbage that they force on us. So what Bitcoin did is you cannot ban it. There is nobody to go after. The person who wrote the code is anonymous. Satoshi Nakamoto is almost certainly not named Satoshi Nakamoto. It's a pen name. Now, it's striking that, usually when things are invented, right, like when Edison invented the light bulb, he was not doing this anonymously, right? Right. In fact, on the contrary, he was claiming credit for everything under the sun. Generally entrepreneurs, people who invent extremely useful things, we know Bitcoin is useful because it has $1 trillion market capitalization, extremely useful. Normally, they're not anonymous. Why? Because they don't assume that they're going to get thrown in jail for 20 years. So it's very important when we sort of look at the general ecosystem. There are people who complain. They say, no, we need a gold-based currency because you can drop gold on your foot. It's real. Demand is durable. Agree. Gold currency would be fantastic. Good luck. Where is it? All right. Gold currencies are superior. Where are they? Well, the answer is they've all been banned. Gold is extremely easy to ban. For the same reason you can drop it on your foot, they can drop it in their bag. It's very easy to come and get. FDR, there was almost no pushback when he seized gold. Now, not all gold was turned in. People kept some gold illegally, bless their hearts. But in terms of being a functional money, if it's buried 4 feet in your backyard so the feds don't find it, that is not a money anymore. Right. It's a store of value. It's not a money. So that's really what Bitcoin inhabits. Is the idea is extremely clever, just a list, a decentralized list, okay, and then it's got little codes that you use in order to access it. Absolutely brilliant construction. The supply is limited, so X number of new coins are created every 10 minutes. The number of new coins gets lower and lower and lower. So that means at current supply inflation in Bitcoin, meaning the number of new coins that are created, it's about comparable to gold at the moment, but it drops in half every 4 years. So, in another couple of years, it'll be significantly lower inflation than gold, and then it keeps going after that to zero. So it's a brilliant invention, and for libertarians, I think the single biggest selling point is that you can't ban it.
I think a lot of people are going to ask as they get into this world, if they choose to do so with the Bitcoin stuff, is what is this? Is it money that I can spend? You mentioned peer-to-peer. Is it something where I can, for instance, buy a book from an author that wants to accept Bitcoin? Or is this a store of value right now? Is this something I invest in? Obviously, it's very volatile at the moment, as a lot of new things tend to be. What would you say to that person asking, what do I do with this stuff? Do I invest in it? Do I spend it? Is it going to replace the dollar? I'm confused.
Right. So, broadly, there are two things that you do with money. You save it and you spend it. They're, of course, connected to each other. But, you've got some money in your wallet and you've got some money in the bank. And generally, the money in the bank is much larger than the money in the wallet. But it's important in order to hold money in the bank, you have to be confident that all that bank money can someday become wallet money. Okay, so there is a connection between the two, but fundamentally, those are the two things that we do with money. That is why there's money demand. That's why people are willing to trade things for money, because you can do those two things with it. You can put it in your wallet to trade it for other stuff in future, or you can put it in the bank with which to buy things in the even more future, right? So fundamentally, those are the two activities. Those are also called savings and transacting. And the sort of shorthand for those two functions, for savings, it's store of value. And for transacting, it's medium of exchange, all right? Now, when Bitcoin first came out, most people thought that it was a medium of exchange. And this is partly because Bitcoin itself, I think, had a big influence on how most of us think about money. So, before Bitcoin, generally, even libertarian economists thought of money as primarily something you spend. It's a medium of exchange. And so my first article on Bitcoin, for example, which was in 2015 on Mises, I was excited about its potential as a medium of exchange. And at the time, the fees on Bitcoin were almost nothing. I mean, it was like, I don't know, it was like a penny or two. And so at that time, you could use it just like you would use a credit card. Right, so you would find a merchant who accepted it. There were an increasing number of merchants who did accept it, like websites. I think Overstock might have accepted it back then. Anyway, there were a bunch of places that did accept it. There were bars and cafes and restaurants. There were a lot of places that accepted Bitcoin back then because the fees were low. And so that was really the initial selling point, is that you can use it just like your credit card, but the fees are much lower than a credit card. And what happened over time is that Bitcoin got popular. And that popularity, there's a limited capacity on the Bitcoin network itself. Okay, it can only process, I think it's 6 transactions a second. It's a fairly limited number of transactions. And so there was because of that increased popularity, the fees started going up, and the fees started getting to $10, $20. Now, that's fine if you're moving savings, so for example, typical bank transactions, if you're paying your credit card bill, if you're going to the ATM, okay, there are a number of sort of bank level transactions that people might accept paying, $2 or $5 or $10 for. Indeed, I think a money transfer typically costs about $20. So, so as the fees went up, it started to get to where Bitcoin was fine for that sort of a transaction. But, obviously, if there's a $10 fee, you're not going to buy a coffee with it, right? And indeed, that's why a lot of businesses stopped accepting it, because the fees went up, right? So, there were a lot of bars early on. People were very excited about how many businesses were accepting Bitcoin, and then that went down because of the fees. And some of us at the time were sort of raising the alarm about that. We thought it was a problem, and that there was an enormous debate within Bitcoin called the block size debate, where people proposed increasing the size, basically increasing the capacity of Bitcoin. There were other people who disagreed, because their main concern was that if you increase the capacity on Bitcoin, it centralizes. Okay, so rather than millions of individuals being able to run the network, now you might have just a couple of players. You might have 20 or 50 players, and that would make it much more vulnerable to being banned. Right, it would make it more vulnerable to government pressure. And so that was a big debate going on. The way that it was resolved was to stick with the original plan, stick with the smaller blocks, meaning the higher fees, because that security was existentially important. I think everybody in Bitcoin expects that a coming boss battle is coming with governments. They're going to do their best to kill this thing. It hasn't threatened them enough yet, right? They still regard it as this goofy thing off on the side. It hasn't hit structurally. The banks are not afraid of it yet. Okay, they're still regarding it as kind of a fun asset to try to get customers to buy into, and then you can take fees. Okay. So, there's still sort of parasites on Bitcoin at this point. They don't regard it as an existential threat. If and when it becomes an existential threat, then the bankers will have, they have Rolodexes. They have very expensive senators on those Rolodexes. So I think all of us expect the boss battle to come. And so I changed my mind on that block size as well, right? Early on, I thought the MOE, being able to use Bitcoin to buy a coffee, I thought it was important because it's much more intuitive. It's much more easier for people to understand that it's a credit card, but with lower fees.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I came on board because, looking at how governments were treating Bitcoin, there's just an endless campaign against Bitcoin to try to shut it down. So I concluded that indeed that's most important. Now, there are other cryptocurrencies. There was a sort of spin-off of Bitcoin called Bitcoin Cash, Monero, Dash, Litecoin. There's thousands of separate coins. Some of them are more or less trustworthy. Without recommending any of them specifically, there are a lot of coins that you can use for medium of exchange. Okay, a lot of these coins have extremely low fees. I think Bitcoin Cash, for example, fees are typically like a third of a penny, right? So what some people do is that you put your savings in Bitcoin because it's safe, right? It's safe to being destroyed by the government. You put your savings in Bitcoin, and then when you go out to buy something, you basically treat it like an ATM, right? You transfer $500 worth of Bitcoin into either an exchange or, some other wallet. And then you use, let's say, Bitcoin Cash or Litecoin to go buy a coffee. So that's probably where we're going to go in the future, is that these medium of exchange coins, those work in terms of the customer, they feel more like a Visa card. But then you keep your sort of life savings in Bitcoin because it is more secure.
I want to tell you about your one-stop shop for all things CBD, and they've got a brand new website for you to check out, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. And it's the Paloma Verde store, of course, owned by a great couple, Carlos and Vanessa, out of San Antonio, Texas. Carlos is a very bright young man. I can tell you why. Once you go to the new website, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, you'll realize that he's smart enough to feature the better looking of the two on the brand new website. And you'll see what I mean once you go there. They've got everything you need as far as the world of CBD goes. You can explore their products on the new website page. You can see obviously they've got the tinctures, but they've got mint tinctures, they've got soft gels, they've got CBD gummies, multiple flavors of those, the salve stick, the sleep bundle, which I'm going to have to check out. I've not had the sleep bundle yet, but that sounds enticing to me. The menthol sports cream, I can tell you, works amazingly. I've used that multiple times. And one of the biggest fans I personally know of Paloma Verde CBD products is my French bulldog named Lux. He's about 10 years old now, which in dog years makes him like 70 or something, right? He's old, and he gets around like a little old man with his back legs a little bit slower than they used to be, until we started putting the CBD pet products that they have at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. We put it on his food every morning. They also have these dog treats that we give him, and it's amazing the job that the products have done for Lux, my French bulldog. Now he's trotting around like he's young again. He gets in and out of the doggy door with ease, which is a relief to me, I can tell you that. So, of course, I've got a promo code for you. It is BUCK, B-U-C-K. When you enter BUCK, the promo code at checkout, you get 25% off of all of your orders over $75, which is a bargain. That's over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com, their new website. Promo code BUCK, get you 25% off all orders over $75. Let's get back to the show. What do you think's causing the volatility right now of a lot of us that have money in it, and it's, oh my God, it's up to 50,000 per Bitcoin. And then all of a sudden it drops to 30. And it's like, I know there's like rats off the sinking ship. There's people like, screw this, I'm out of here. I thought this was something different. And then there's other people saying, well, naturally it's going to do this for a little bit. We'll see where it levels out. What's causing it? And do you see a level out coming at some point?
Yeah, there are a couple reasons for it. First of all, it's absolutely normal. It's to be expected. If you look at the .com era, when the Amazon and Yahoo and all these companies first started, they were incredibly volatile. And, I was a day trader back then in my misspent youth. And, they would go up down 20% a day. Now, if you had held Amazon, you'd be a millionaire. Okay. So, it comes with the territory. It's the same with venture investing. Venture capitalists, they buy a tiny little company because they believe in it, and it'll double or half by day. This is how it works. This is how venture investing works. So that's kind of the first point, is that it's perfectly normal. The solution as an individual investor is, number one, you have to understand what's the big picture here. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you were an Amazon buyer in 1997, it was very important that if you had bought Amazon because because you're a momentum trader, or you saw the head and shoulders and the candlestick pattern, all right, you consulted the horoscope. All right, if you bought it for one of those reasons, don't do that, because when it collapses, you're going to panic. Human nature. You say you won't, but you will. Okay. And you're going to sell at the bottom. All right. So if you don't understand why you're buying Bitcoin, don't touch it. All right. You're going to get burned. Right. Because you're not going to be able to hold on. All right. So the key, whether you're buying Amazon in 1997 or Bitcoin in 2021, you have to understand what is the play. Right. Now, in the case of Amazon, the play was that, first of all, it was really well run. You could see immediately. It was very disciplined on market share, very good customer service, very well run operation. Number two, the meta play was that there were still a lot of people in 1997 who thought that the internet was going to vanish. Mm-hmm. Right, Paul Krugman, with his famous he said people were going to get sick of sharing cat photos, and we're going to realize that we didn't really have anything to say. So we're going to get bored and we're going to go find something else. Right, so that betrays such a misunderstanding of human nature, okay? But the point is that he's a fairly smart guy. He was fairly smart in 1997 as well. And if he was that dumb, then you could look at that and you could say, well, there's probably a lot of people who are that dumb right now who are not yet invested in e-commerce and the internet, but will be, right? Because they will figure it out. And lo and behold, what happened? Oh my goodness, they figured it out. And Amazon skyrocketed, right? So the key there is, sort of the big picture play on Amazon in 1997 was the world doesn't understand how big the internet's going to be. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so by buying Amazon, what you were really buying is you were buying a bet that the internet is going to be bigger than people expect. All right. And in retrospect, that was a fantastic bet. Right. But that's really what you were buying. If you were buying Amazon for that reason, you would have held on through anything. Mm-hmm. Because you believe in the thesis. Right. So similarly, if there are some people who buy Bitcoin just because it's going up. And then there are other people who buy it because they understand the thesis, right? The thesis is that Bitcoin is going to replace existing monies. It's going to replace gold for a lot of functions. It's much more useful than gold. You can transfer it over a distance at much lower fees than gold. If you do $1 billion transaction on Bitcoin, it will cost you $10. Right, Bitcoin doesn't care how many you're transferring. Whatever the fees are, the fees are. It doesn't matter how many. That's mind-blowing. Okay? You try transfer and it'll take 10 minutes. All right, you try that. You try moving $1 billion cash. You're talking weeks. Yeah. You're talking multiple lawyers. All right, it is an operation. I don't know, it might cost 50,000. It's an operation. Now try moving $1 billion in gold. France did this, right? Back during the gold standard, France did this. They wanted to move a bunch of gold out of New York. They sent an aircraft carrier. No joke, right? So what's that cost? That's more than $50,000, all right? So, the thesis on Bitcoin is that it's going to replace a significant portion of gold demand because it's a better currency than gold, much cheaper, much harder to seize, and it'll likely seize some percent of cash demand because it doesn't inflate the way that US dollars or Venezuelan bolivars do. So that's fundamentally the play. If you're buying Bitcoin, you are buying the hypothesis that Bitcoin is going to replace a significant share of gold demand, some share of paper money demand, and maybe other forms of demand as well. If you have the opportunity to save your money in something that's not inflationary, some people might pull money out of the market, right? There are a lot of people right now who they're invested in stocks, not because they want to be. They might be very, very conservative. Okay, they're not invested in stocks because they want to be. They're invested in stocks because they have to be, right? The money is inflating. They're losing value. Prices are going up. And so they feel that they're sort of forced to take risks to keep their money growing, or it's not going to last through their retirement, right? So there are a lot of people who are involuntary stock investors, and if they had the opportunity to save in something that was mildly deflationary, meaning the value goes up every year, goes up a little bit, they might be interested in doing that. So if Bitcoin picks up some demand from gold, some demand from cash, and some demand even from stocks, it will have a very significant value.
You wrote something I found interesting in one of your posts on Substack, and it was that fiat money allows a government to declare economic independence from the people. And I thought it seems like Bitcoin allows the people to declare independence from government. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. Absolutely. Right. Fiat money, what it does to governments is they don't need tax revenue anymore. Right. So traditionally, there's this parasitic relationship where we produce stuff and government comes over and takes a cut, kind of like a mafia. And the problem here is there's a certain healthy, it's a horrible fact of life, but there's a certain healthy symbiosis in that the government wants us to continue producing stuff so it can take some of it. And once the government can print its own money, it doesn't need us anymore. Right. And we saw this during lockdowns.
Yeah.
Right. So you saw where, at the federal level, they really didn't care what happened to us because they're doing fine. They got money, they didn't worry about tax revenue. Now, there were some local jurisdictions that did worry about tax revenue. And that's why, broadly speaking, it was the local jurisdictions that were pushing to open. Now, they ended up getting a federal bailout through one of Biden's bills here. So that reversed that, healthy parasitism. So when the government doesn't need us anymore, right, at that point, it moves on to its other hobbies, which generally include putting new burdens on entrepreneurs. And, it's not being punished for hurting us anymore, right? We could literally be starving and the government would be doing A-OK because they got their own money. They don't need us.
Do you find that people tend to, when you look at things like Bitcoin or a lot of the ideas I find in libertarianism, when you pitch them to a quote unquote normie, there's more skepticism placed on our ideas by a normal person than the current status quo. Do you they'll look at Bitcoin and go, well, this, without turning that same lens on, let's say, the dollar.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Absolutely. If the dollar didn't exist and you were to propose it, people have done this with crypto where they they describe the dollar as if it was a brand new crypto. Okay, so good. How's it work? You have one point of failure. You have one group who decides how many of them are going to be in existence. And, you just have to take it. You have no option to opt out. Everybody is forced to use it. You as a business person have to accept dollars legally. It's called legal tender. You can accept other stuff, but you have to accept dollars, right? Imagine if somebody proposed a law, let's make it so everybody has to accept Bitcoin. That'd be crazy, right? We would say that's completely insane. What if people don't want Bitcoin? You don't have that option with dollars. So, right, if you run government stuff through the same skeptical lens that you would run any crazy idea, because, generally it is insane. The idea that, the government would seize everything of value, it would replace it with a bunch of paper, and then it would just kind of randomly make that go up and down. Why would anybody want this? Why is that a good idea? So for sure, there's I think we need a lot more skepticism towards the stuff governments come up with. Governments are aware of this. That's why they try to dress it up, and they have these beautiful courthouses and or legislature. I would like governments to meet in strip malls. Everybody has to wear shorts and funny hats to take some of the mystique away from it. But yes. Right, most normies, most people, they assume that the government knows what it's doing. They assume that there's a good reason for it. When you dig into these things in reality, there is almost never a good reason for it. There's often a good deal of corruption. Generally things governments do are negotiations between what sounds good on TV in a soundbite and who paid you to do it.
Yeah.
And, the job of politicians is to delicately steer the ship of state between corrupt and sounds good on TV.
Yes.
It's pretty pathetic. It's amazing that anybody takes any of this seriously. It is a clown show.
Before we get out of here, I want to ask, I hear this criticism too regarding Bitcoin and I have leveled this criticism before I knew much about it, that the government will come after it and will shut it down somehow. Governments, we could say. Is that possible? Is that a reality? What are your thoughts?
It is. Anything is possible. You could shut down the entire internet, and then you could hunt down any pirate blockchain broadcasters. Anything is possible. When you ask about scenarios like that, you generally want to ask, what are the interests of everybody involved, right? In that kind of a scenario, obviously it would cause more harm to a government to shut down all of the electricity, for example. And so we can pretty safely say that that's not going to happen. So, there are extreme scenarios, and you can say, well, what if every government in the world at the same time seized all the mining equipment? There are certain, yes, there are scenarios, and this is true for anything under the sun.
Yeah.
The point here is that gold is bannable with probability 100%. Why? Because it's been done. Bitcoin is bannable with probability, I'd guess, 1%. Possible? It is, but we would have to have a very different world. We'd have to have more or less one world government. We'd have to have a number of things in order for that to happen. So in the meantime, I think the operating assumption is that if you're interested in some sort of money that is not stolen from you in your sleep through inflation, this is the best hope by far.
Well put. Let's get you to plug anything you'd like, your Substack, your online presence, Twitter, all of that.
I'm pretty active on Twitter, Prof Stonge, Profstonge. I also have a Substack where it's a free Substack, but I write about Austrian economics and crypto. You can find that at my Twitter, or it's cryptoeconomy.substack.com.
Excellent. I'll link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode. Peter, thank you so much for joining us here on Counterflow.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right. Before we get out of here, I have to tell you guys, and I always say I'm not good at selling things. It's just not in my nature, but the website is going, and the new t-shirts are up on the website, counterflowpodcast.com. See the Counterflow Podcast t-shirts. We also even have Death to Tyrants from the old show. We have some of those t-shirts. I have a few left. They're on clearance, so you can get those for $10. And what else I want to tell you about? My friend Mark Metz has a great Substack. I know you guys are familiar with that platform. And if you're interested in sort of a paleo-leaning liberty perspective, I highly recommend his Substack newsletters. They're really good. The Emergent, it's called, Pursuing Autonomy, Advocating Liberty, and Defending Freedom. You can find that at Mark Metz, markmetz.substack.com. And like I said, I highly recommend it. You can also find his stuff and his interactions in our Telegram group. Mark is a part of that Telegram group. Go get the app and then find Counterflow with Buck Johnson room there on Telegram. Of course, the YouTube channel is slowly picking up steam. All of these interviews I do are now broadcast on YouTube, the video form. So if that's the way you like to consume this stuff, join us on YouTube. Obviously, just type in the name of this podcast and you will find our YouTube page. Go to iTunes, if you will, and leave us a rating and review. And I think that about wraps up everything for this week. You guys have an excellent week, and I will talk to you soon.
You get split in fucking half. The icon, the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been the Counterflow Podcast, a part of the Renegade Media Network.